sort of challenge in today's session is how we try to create value from innovation. Okay? I guess the argument is twofold. One is you don't have to innovate to create value. There are other ways, yeah? There are many other ways of creating value, both commercial and social, without innovation. But at least for the purpose of this module, we're not terribly interested in those. And conversely, you can innovate without creating any real value, social or otherwise. Okay, so the two aren't sort of synonymous. So we need to understand, if you like, how different types of innovation can result in different types of value creation. And that's really what the rest of the session is about. Okay, these benchmark studies, indices, are all over the place. The Economists do one. The Financial Times, the UK Financial Times had one about 2 weeks ago where it compared different countries. The Economist has one each year as well, and there's a few commercial consultancies that also have them, and this is yet another one. So don't worry too much about the decimal points and the absolute rankings. It depends. It's a bit like university rankings or any other ranking. It depends on how you measure stuff and what the weightings are by category. What's quite nice about this index is that it tries to cover almost everything. The national context, the education system, knowledge flows in and out of the country, outcomes, patents, R&D. So it's not sort of just based on, say, patents and R&D. So it's quite a broad spectrum of types of innovation it tries to capture. But then the question is, when you get one number, they've got to aggregate it up into an index. Then it gets a bit mucky. So the absolute index is less important than if you go onto their website, if you do a search, is how they build up the index from the different components and what weightings they put on. And that's really quite interesting. Okay? But really the message for that slide or any slide like that is there is still quite a big disparity. However you measure innovation, R&D, patents, new products, gross value added, there are big disparities across countries. That's what this is saying. Yeah? Within countries, across regions. So there's huge debates, you know, in different countries about regional contributions to both gross value added and also innovation, and within countries across sectors. Okay, so there's lots of, if you like, variation. And the trick is to try to understand how much of that is sort of contextual or random and how much can be managed, because this particular module is primarily interested in what can we manage. So you need to understand the environment, whether it's the national, the regional, or the sector, because it has an influence. But then you need to figure out within that context, what can you actually, you know, influence or manage in terms of sort of agency, okay? Because some of it is determined by the sector, some by the region, some by the country, okay? Okay. By the way, China's not at the bottom, it goes down to like 167, okay? The slide would be quite tedious, even more tedious to do that, so I'm not suggesting China's at the bottom. And if you're interested in innovation in China, there were 2 reports in the last 2 weeks by an amazing coincidence. One in The Economist, which is a weekly thing, and one in the FT a couple of weeks ago, which is a sort of daily journal. Okay, so you can track those out if you do a Google search or you search the library. They're quite interesting, but they focus too much on research and development for my liking, anyway. Okay. Oh, that's not good slides in there. Let's get the... I think that's about it. Okay, first thing is, and I'll say it again and again and again, and then you always get one person in the exam who says, and this is like 15 weeks later, innovation is essentially technology. And you think, this is not going to go well, is it? Okay, so we'll start from week 1. Technology can be important for innovation. Okay, I have a technical background, so I'm biased towards that. But even so, if you look at the evidence in practice, academic studies, it's almost never ever sufficient. You know, whether you're developing an app for a smartphone or a new drug in pharmaceuticals, they sound like really high-tech things. But if you look at actually how they happen, the technology is never sufficient. Okay, so one of the tricks is to understand how important is it, okay, and what else do we have to manage to make it work. And going back to the previous slide, that's why you've got to be careful how you measure innovation, whether you're a company or a country. Okay, and a lot of people look at things like patents and spending and things like that, and then they try to make inferences about that. This slide, if nothing else, tells you that patents are not a good measure of innovation. Okay? We'll talk about patents in a few weeks' time when we look at intellectual property, and we'll look at what they can and cannot do in terms of managing innovation. Well, what I can tell you now is they're not a terribly good indicator of innovation, but they're widely used by governments, policymakers, economists, because the data's there in the public domain. Yeah? But in terms of management, they're not very good because there's not a strong relationship with other things. Okay, so patents are basically a legal property right in most regimes. Okay, and these are real patents that were filed, and there's several 100,000 patents filed every single day somewhere. So, and there's a lot of noise, a lot of dross in that. Okay, so it's certainly not about just patents, and it's not even just about technology. Even when you look at those high-tech sectors, you know, like IT and pharmaceuticals, when you actually dig deeper and understand how innovation works, technology is never, ever sufficient. Okay? Almost never the best technology wins in isolation. It's often part of other things, as we're seeing. Okay. If we look at some sort of stylized data means two things. It means I haven't referenced it properly, yeah, which is a very bad practice. If you say something in an essay, not in an exam, so that's unfair, but in an essay or a report, you should reference it, whether it's a web link or an article or a book. I haven't done it here because it'd be tedious. What we're trying to do is aggregate up the sort of general orders of magnitude. So we sort of call that stylized fact. It's more true than not. Okay, it's an order of magnitude. Okay, so it's lots and lots of studies aggregated up. Okay, first thing is, which is the first bullet is the inverse of the last bullet. So 2 for the price of 1. The vast majority of firms do not grow, or put it another way, very few firms grow. Yeah. And that's a problem because there are lots of studies that suggest innovation is related to growth, and then we need to figure out, you know, how is it related? And we often use growth as a sort of an indicator, a proxy for success. The other one is survival, which is not such a good measure. Yeah, so that observation makes it quite difficult then to understand, well, what is it? Is it intent? Is it ability? Is it the environment? And we'll try to understand that as we go through the module. So, put it another way, the things we're talking about over the next 13 weeks are quite rare. Yeah, depending how you define innovation, inputs and outputs, it's around about 5% of organisations plus or minus sort of 1%. So between 4 and 6% of organisations, private, public, large, small, innovate in any measurable way. So they're the exception, not the rule. So we're not talking about, as I said in the introduction, general business management. We put that to one side for the moment. That's the other 95 plus or minus 1%, which is very important because it's the majority of organisations. But we're looking at, over the next 13 weeks, if you like, the special cases. Okay? What makes them work and not work? Second bullet point, with hindsight should have numbered these, second bullet point is that most ideas never get anywhere, never reach the market. Yeah? Why do you think that is? And why does it matter? There's 2 good questions for you. So the first question is, why do you think that very few ideas get to the market? And the second question, sub-question is, so what? Why does it matter? Any thoughts? Hmm? Yeah, there's, I haven't got the radio mic, so I'll come back over here. The comment was, companies shelve them, they put them to one side. Yeah, there's a very high attrition rate, and you can get these lovely, called development funnels, where you get like 1 million ideas, you end up with one after 6 months, 6 years, depending on the sector and the size of the company. But there's a high attrition rate or failure rate. Sometimes it's deliberate, that they say, okay, we can only resource so many, so there's a resource constraint, and sometimes it's just luck, serendipity. Things fail and they never get there. Yeah. So we'd argue on this particular module, it's poor process. Okay, that ideas are just one input to innovation, and all the really hard stuff happens then. Yeah. How do you refine it, test it, prototype it, learn, fail? Yeah. And we'll talk about all that sort of stuff. So we're saying actually it's not synonymous with innovation. Actually, it's not the hardest part of innovation. So one explanation is, if you like, you don't have a process if you rely on that. And the sort of so what sort of comes from that. It means that the so what is ideas are not as important as you might think in innovation management. And some people have a preconception that innovation management is all about ideas, therefore it's all about creativity. It's a very slippery logic. Okay, if we look at the evidence, ideas are an input, but they're only one of many inputs. Okay, so we need to put them in their place. Okay, so it's not just about ideas, not just about creativity. Next one down, R&D projects. The majority, I can say that, sometimes it's more, than 60%, sometimes it's 70, 80%. So it can be even more never. So this is different to ideas. These are projects that are funded, they cost money, okay? They have people, they have resources, they're consuming resources. So these are much, much more, if you like, real and codified than a simple idea. And nonetheless, the majority are not commercial successes. So what does that tell us, if anything? Or put it another way, if you're an R&D manager, and there are still many, what would you aim for? 100% success? No? Yes?
About 90.
About 90, well, it's a good answer, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, there's going to be some margin of error. We began talking about managing or understanding uncertainty, and truly, yeah, even in the most mundane innovation like product development, there is uncertainty. Okay, so you're going to have to build in some sort of margin of acceptable failure or error. And the question is how much? So the 60% is an average across all sectors and types of innovation, radical, incremental, so it's not very helpful. So what you would do in a real life case is to figure out what type of industry are we in? Yeah? How well do we understand our customers, our markets? How mature are the technologies, the inputs? Okay? How highly regulated is it? How mature is it in terms of growth rates? And you pull all those into the mix and you can get an idea of what is an acceptable level, which might be 90, yeah? Or it might be 20. Okay? But trying to get an idea of what you can reasonably expect given the nature of the uncertainty in that context. And that's really, really important. Because in the absence of understanding that, what happens is people say, well, that R&D's failing, the majority's failing, so we need to manage it even more. Yeah? And what happens then when you manage things like R&D more and more? If you try to drive down uncertainty to say, you know, a few percentage points, you get more and more incremental innovation, take less and less risk. Yeah? And that's what you find in industries and companies go down that route. Okay? They tend to have more successes on paper, but less impressive successes. Yeah? And we'll talk about companies and studies that show that. Okay, moving onwards. And we'll take the next two, and the last one we've done already, the inverse. The two things here. One is, even in products and service development, there is a high rate of failure. And that's probably the most well understood field of innovation. I mean, next teaching block, as we call them now, most of you will do, I think it's a core on some and an option on other. Anyway, so one on product and service development. And you look at this in more detail. But basically you find that even in products and service development, which is where we have the most tools and understanding in terms of innovation management, there is a failure rate. Okay, sometimes more or less than that. Let's take that as given. But within that, what you find is that there are very different rates of failure, or if you want, rates of success, just the inverse, in business to business versus business to consumer. And what you generally find is that the failure rate in business to consumer is much, much higher than in business to business. So, my question to you again is, why do you think that might be? And secondly, what are the implications, the so what? So the first question, why do you think there's such a big difference between the success rate between business to business and business to consumer? Generally speaking, business to consumer is less successful in terms of products and service development than business to business. Any thoughts on why that might be?
There are fewer barriers between business to business and business to consumer.
What?
There are fewer sort of businesses, or fewer businesses compared to customers to kind of certain.
Okay. So there's a couple of things there. When you say barriers, and also fewer of them, not always, but generally speaking, not always, because you can get very high scale business to business, you know, things like accountancy software, for example. But generally speaking, there are fewer customers in business to business. I say generally speaking. Yeah, so it's not easier, but you can identify them as discrete entities rather than just abstract things like target markets. So that's one thing. And the second thing, when you mention barriers, is often you can have some sort of communication with them, which is not necessarily a mass communication or some sort of social network promotion. Okay, so it's a more like a dialogue. Yeah, so you can extract information from them, which is not the case normally in business to consumer. You normally push a product or service out and wait for something to happen, and you try to get feedback to improve it, but often it's not precise. Okay, so the nature of the relationship's different, and that is one of the reasons that happens. So what about the so what? What do you think the implications are in terms of innovation? in those two different types of relationship, business to business and business to consumer. Yeah.
Maybe business to business, there are more often chains. There are more often like trying things instead of business to consumers.
Okay, so you're half right, which is half more than these guys. They didn't say anything. So you're half right. Do you know which half it is? You're right. The reason's right, but the logic's the other way. So if you didn't hear, because I've got a microphone you don't have, is the idea is that I'll paraphrase if you will, is that the customers are different in terms of their propensity to take change or to try new products and services. Okay? And if you look at the evidence, and I can see your logic, but if you look at the actual evidence, you find it's the reverse of what you suggested in terms of the propensity to accept innovation. Okay? So business to business relationships tend to be much more conservative. Okay? In the sense, they don't want too much change because it might disrupt other things. And often it's embedded in a process or a system which is sometimes critical for creating value. So they don't want to change everything overnight. They want to incrementally improve and add things. And in fact, when you look at business to business innovation, often that relationship, because it's closer, the point you made earlier, is that you find the potential customers are articulating what they need. And their articulated needs are quite incremental. You want more of this, less of this, higher yield, lower waste, or whatever. So they're really quite narrowly defined. So you tend to find in business to business innovation, okay, high success rate, tick, good, but not so good is a very incremental path, okay, of innovation and improvement. Whereas in business to consumer, it's almost the reverse, is you get higher failure rates. It's almost like an experiment, okay, because we can't articulate as consumers really what we want, even if people ask. Generally, they don't ask, and they just launch something, and we have to respond. And sometimes they try to ask using market research and get it wrong, okay, because it's very imperfect, as we'll see later. Okay, but either way, they get it wrong a lot more often. Okay, but when they get it right, it can be quite a step change in performance because we have less investment. It's not going to destroy our businesses and such like if it goes wrong. Okay, so you get a very different dynamic. So yeah.
Yeah, so like both customers have different preferences.
Yeah.
And, if company want to just like demand all of them, they need to make that and do all progresses. But for the business, if they can make sure that it's a win-win or they can get benefits from each other, so then they will make contract or make relationship.
Yeah, yeah. But the different preferences, are you saying it's a good or a bad thing for consumer markets? You're right, they're completely different preferences. And yeah. Okay, so the nature of the relationship and the nature of the different types of customer, okay, mean you get a very different dynamic in terms of innovation. And you find that sector by sector, company by company. So I guess on this slide, apart from some stylized facts, it's basically saying be very careful about generalizing, okay, in terms of innovation. So try to understand the general rule and then what the exceptions are, okay, what works in what different type of context. Okay, so we're going to try to, over the whole module, introduce things that are relatively well understood in terms of research and practice at work, but then we need to be a bit more sophisticated. This is a master's course, not a consultancy pitch, to say, well, under what conditions do they work well? Okay, and that might be size of company, nature of relationship to the market, the national system it's in, etc., etc. And we'll try to be sensitive to that as we go along. But the tagline, and this only really applies to, say, with-profit organisations. Most of the research on innovation management, for better or for worse, partly because it's easier to measure these things, has been with private companies' commercial goals. Okay, and even they had different goals: growth, market share, profitability, value added. But nonetheless, it's easier to measure that than it is social innovation. So we will try to pick up as we go along the bits of research on social innovation, and the final session we'll try to sum up what we think we know about social innovation. But bear with me. I mean, a lot of the stuff we're going to cover anyway is relevant to social innovation because it discusses things like outcomes, services, processes, which are all relevant across the board, whatever your objectives are. Okay, but generally speaking, there is strong evidence that you get these things right and there are positive outcomes in terms of profitability, growth, employment, and also social utility.